The room was called a reception hall, but it felt more like a stage. The law firm had booked it at Graham's insistence. He'd said a private dining room wouldn't be enough for an evening of this magnitude, and now 200 people moved through it in good suits and winter wool, carrying champagne glasses that nobody was actually drinking. Ingrid Calvert stood near the far window with her glass untouched. Across the room, her husband was surrounded. Graham Calvert had a particular quality in crowds. He expanded into them, became more of whatever he already was, and tonight he was very much the newly appointed senior partner of Breckenridge and Calvert, a firm that now carried his name on the letterhead on the door, on the brass plate outside the Bay Street building. He laughed at something. Someone clapped him on the shoulder. He looked like a man who had decided long ago that this was exactly where he belonged. Ingrid watched him the way she watched spreadsheets. Calmly, looking for what was real underneath what was presented. She had heard the speech. Everyone in the room had heard the speech. Graham had stood at the front for 11 minutes. She'd timed it without meaning to, the way she always timed things. And he had thanked the partners, the senior associates, the junior staff. He had thanked clients by name. He had thanked his mentor Arthur Breckenridge, who was 73, and visibly moved. He had thanked the city of Toronto for being the kind of place where a kid from Sudbury could build something that lasted. He had not mentioned Ingrid. Not once in 11 minutes in a room full of people who had eaten the meals she had organized, drunk the wine she had selected, and attended the events she had quietly arranged for years without anyone thinking to ask who was behind them. The woman beside her, a client's wife whose name Ingrid had learned that evening, and would remember long afterward, said something pleasant. Ingrid smiled and answered, and the conversation continued for a few minutes before drifting away, as conversations at these events always did. Ingrid took a single sip of champagne. It was good. It should have been. 3 weeks earlier, the firm's events coordinator had called her for recommendations, and Ingrid had reached out to her contact at a Niagara-on-the-Lake winery and arranged a price that was substantially better than whatever the coordinator would have found independently. Nobody at the firm knew she had done that. Graham certainly didn't know. He'd said the wine was excellent and kept talking. She set the glass down on a passing tray. Outside the window, February snow lay in yellow pools under the street lamps, and the city looked exactly like itself. Cold, indifferent, beautiful in the specific way of things that do not require your attention. She understood, standing there, that something had shifted inside her, not broken, shifted. The drive home was quiet in the way of a car where one person is present and the other is elsewhere. Graham was still inside the warmth of the evening, jacket unbuttoned, one hand easy on the wheel, talking about a deal he expected to close before the end of March. Ingrid looked at the highway lights and said the right things at the right intervals and felt, with unusual precision, the full weight of 12 years. 12 years. That was the number she kept returning to. They had arrived in Toronto together, newly married, both trained as architects, with overlapping ambitions and a shared certainty that they would build something together. By the end of the first year, one set of ambitions had expanded and the other had contracted. The way things do when one person in a partnership stops pushing back and starts making room instead. It had not happened all at once. It never does. The first time was in year 3. Graham had been offered early partnership, too early for the financial exposure it carried, and Ingrid had noticed. In the way she noticed everything, quietly, without drawing attention to the noticing, that the transition would leave them critically thin if 2 particular receivables were delayed. She had said so carefully one evening at the kitchen island. Graham had told her not to worry. He had said he had a handle on things. She had waited 3 weeks to see if the handle would hold. It didn't. She transferred funds from her own investment account, money she had been building since her mid-20s with a discipline no one in her life had ever remarked upon, and covered the shortfall without a word. Graham called it a slow quarter that corrected itself. He told a colleague later that year that he'd navigated a tricky transition through careful positioning. She had filed that moment away, not with bitterness, with clarity. By year 5, she had stopped flagging the pressure points aloud. Graham listened to her financial observations with the patient expressions of someone waiting for the subject to change, and she had learned, without resentment, that the most effective thing she could do was handle it quietly. So she became the architecture that the building stood on, invisible by design, essential by function. There was the contact. That was perhaps the largest thing, the one that occupied more space than the others, when she thought about what she had given to a life that had given her no acknowledgement in return. Her colleague Moira Chen ran her family's commercial property portfolio across Ontario, a portfolio that needed legal restructuring of significant complexity, and Ingrid had introduced them at a gallery opening in 2019. A casual thing, a hand on an arm, a mention. 6 months later, the Chen account had become the defining contract of Graham's early partnership career, the one he referenced in every professional profile, the one that had made his name synonymous with a certain caliber of estate and commercial law. He had never acknowledged in any room that she had made that introduction. She hadn't needed him to. She had understood the exchange. But understanding something and carrying it indefinitely, she was discovering, were two entirely different things. They got home after 11. Graham checked his phone at the kitchen island, still animated, still inside the evening. Ingrid poured a glass of water, stood at the counter, and looked at the back of his head. She had tried once, properly tried. 4 years ago, a Tuesday in October, she had sat across from him at this very island and told him, directly, without preamble, that she had been managing their investment portfolio for nearly a decade, that she had built something substantial, and that she thought it was time they talked about it openly, as partners. She had used the word we throughout. She had had notes. Graham had listened for approximately 4 minutes. Then his phone had buzzed with something from the office and he had said, "Sounds like you've got it well in hand," and picked up his jacket. She had not tried again. "I'm going to bed," she said. "I won't be long," he said without turning. She was not asleep when he came upstairs. She lay in the dark and thought about everything she had built in this life that had no name on it. The investment positions, opened carefully over 8 years. The reserve account, currently holding enough to cover 14 months of household and operating expenses without a single dollar of incoming income. The Niagara contact, Moira Chen. The events she had planned, the relationships she had maintained, the financial buffer that had quietly absorbed 3 separate near disasters. Without Graham ever feeling the turbulence. Her work was woven through every part of their life, and in 11 minutes, in front of 200 people, it had been nowhere. By 2 in the morning, she had made a decision. She opened her laptop and began to carefully, methodically separate what was hers from what was shared. It took until nearly 4. She sat in the study that Graham called her little corner, though the accounts managed inside it had at various points held more value than his practice, and she looked at the numbers for a long time with her hands still in her lap. She had options. She had always had options. She had simply been choosing not to exercise them. By morning, she had sent 2 emails and placed 1 call. She had not woken Graham. She made coffee, put on her heaviest coat, and walked outside into the February dark for an hour. The street was empty, and the cold was clean, and somewhere above the orange city glow she could imagine stars that weren't visible. When she came back inside, she made him a second cup and left it on the counter, and went upstairs without waiting to hear his door open. He left for the office without saying goodbye. He had stopped doing that sometime in the 4th year. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the sound of his car backing down the driveway. Then she picked up her phone and made the final call. The first sign came 10 days later. A filing associated with the Chen account's secondary portfolio required a coordination call that simply didn't happen. Ingrid had been the informal link between the 2 parties for years. Not officially, never on a retainer, simply the person who made sure the right information reached the right people before confusion became a problem. She had stepped quietly out of that channel. No announcement, no explanation. She was simply no longer there. The delay caused a cascade. Graham's associate called him confused. Graham called the client's office directly and got a junior contact who wasn't sure what to tell him. He assumed a communication error, had the team resubmit the coordination request. Nothing resolved cleanly. 3 weeks later, a commercial developer who had been close to signing with Graham's firm, a referral that had traveled through a contact at a design conference Ingrid attended annually, rejected the file to another firm without explanation. Graham's assistant made 3 calls. The 3rd was not returned. He spent several days being puzzled rather than alarmed. He'd ridden out slow periods before. Business had its own rhythms. Then the supplier calls began. Not the routine kind, the kind that get escalated, the kind where the voice on the other end is flat and patient in the way of someone who has sent prior notices. Because those notices hadn't gone unanswered, they had been answered. Just not by Graham. He was receiving for the first time the real sound of his business unmediated. He started pulling at threads. He found the first file by accident. He'd been looking for a document in the filing cabinet in Ingrid's study. A room he rarely entered, had never felt the need to enter. And behind the expected folders, he found one that didn't belong in his mental architecture of their finances. He opened it. The account statement inside was 22 pages long. He sat down on the floor of her study with his jacket still on and read every page. The numbers didn't confuse him because they were complicated. Ingrid didn't work in complexity for its own sake. They'd confused him because they described a version of his financial life, he had never been told existed. He found a second folder behind the first, a third behind that. He pulled every drawer. He wasn't looking for betrayal. He was looking for a story that would let him put this back into a shape he recognized. What he found instead was architecture. Investment positions opened years before he would have thought to open them. A reserve fund maintained across 8 years, at a balance that would have covered his household and practice for over a year without a dollar of incoming income. A transaction log from 2019 with Moira Chen's name on it, and a note in Ingrid's handwriting that simply read, Gallery Intro, Oct 12. He sat on the floor of her study for a long time, folders open around him, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt afraid. He called her. She was in Vancouver for a client meeting. There are accounts, he said. Something different was in his voice. She heard it immediately. I didn't know any of this existed. She waited. How long? He asked. How long what? How long have you been doing this? Since year 3, she said. You were overextended after the early partnership transition. I covered it. You don't remember it because it was resolved before it became a problem. Silence. Ingrid. The Chen account. Yes. You introduced us. Yes. I've told that story for 5 years, at dinners, in client meetings. How I built the Chen relationship from a cold approach. He stopped. She heard him stop himself, and the stopping was its own kind of answer. You believed it, she said, not an accusation, a fact. I believed it. A long pause. I need to understand, why didn't you ever tell me? I tried once, she said. October 4 years ago, Tuesday evening. You told me it sounded like I had things well in hand, and then you answered a call from the office. She could hear him breathing. I'm going to need access to. No, she said. Just that, no heat, no prepared speech, one word, from a woman who had thought it through long before this phone call. She came home 2 days later. He was at the kitchen island when she walked in, the folders laid out in front of him, and he looked like a man who had been sitting with something very heavy for longer than he could manage. She poured a glass of water and sat across from him. Why didn't you tell me? He said. All of it, any of it. In the beginning I did. Her voice was even. When we first got here, I had plans, Graham. I had projections. You told me we needed to be realistic about which of our tracks had momentum, and that I could build around the edges of our life. You didn't say it to be cruel. I understood that then, and I understand it now. But I understood what was being asked. She paused. I made a choice to be useful in the way I was needed. That isn't what I wanted for you. I know, she said. That's the part I've been sitting with. If you'd been deliberately dismissive, I think I would have said something sooner. But you never considered that there was another version of events. Your story was complete as it was. There was no room in it for what I was doing, and I stopped trying to make room. He had no answer for that. At the dinner, he started. The speech. I don't have an explanation. I was talking and I didn't. He stopped. That's not enough. I know that's not enough. No, she agreed. He put his hands flat on the table. I'm sorry, for the speech, for all of it, for the years of it. I don't even know the full shape of what I'm apologizing for, and that might be the worst part. She studied him the way she studied balance sheets, looking for what was real under what was presented. You believe that right now, she said. Yes. Because you're frightened. Yes, and because it's true. Both things are true and I can't separate them. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to pretend I can. I'm not going to help you manage the fallout, she said. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. No. Not out of cruelty. Because you need to understand what you've been standing on. And the only way to understand that is to stand without it. He nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting a sentence he had already known was coming. She stood, walked down the hall and went upstairs. She lay in the dark, and, for the first time since the evening of the speech, let herself feel the full weight of the 12 years without managing it, without containing it, without converting it into something productive. She cried quietly into the dark of the room. Not with anger, not with grief, exactly. It was something more like finally setting down something she had carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her body. She had been so good at making everything work that she had nearly forgotten she was a person with her own shape, her own weight, her own direction. She lay there until the feeling passed. Then she got up, washed her face, and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. She was still entirely there. What followed was the kind of education that cannot be delivered from the outside. Graham spent 7 weeks learning the actual shape of what he had built, what was genuinely his, made from his talent and his effort, and what had been load-bearing infrastructure he'd never examined. Some of it was genuinely his. More than he'd feared, less than he'd claimed. He went back through the Chen account himself, staying late on filings he had previously delegated, and made 3 calls he had been avoiding for years. He let 2 clients go gracefully rather than pretending to capacity he didn't have. He renegotiated a lease. He apologized to a junior associate he had let carry too much, without context or credit, for 2 years running. He did not ask Ingrid for help. Not because the temptation wasn't real, but because he had begun to understand, quietly and without anyone explaining it to him, that asking for her help before he had changed anything about himself would simply be the same arrangement wearing a different expression. They moved through the house like 2 people learning new geography, careful with each other, honest for the first time in years about the distance. Ingrid took the Vancouver client, then a firm in Ottawa. She was direct in meetings, precise, uninterested in performing confidence she didn't have, and people trusted her quickly because she told them true things and was never surprised to be believed. Her consultancy, which she had kept deliberately small for years, began to take up real space. One morning she was at the kitchen table, laptop open, 3 project files in different windows, coffee going cold at her elbow. She didn't notice Graham come downstairs. She didn't notice him stop in the doorway. He made her a fresh coffee and set it quietly next to the cold one. He went to make his own breakfast without a word. She looked up, looked at the coffee, looked at him, already at the counter with his back turned. She picked up the fresh cup and went back to work. It was a Saturday in April, the first genuinely warm Saturday of the year, when he knocked on the door of her study, actually. Knocked, knuckles on the open frame, standing in the doorway without entering. "I wanted to show you something," he said. He held out a single printed page. "Not to ask for anything, I just wanted you to see it. Because you'd understand it better than anyone. And it felt wrong to keep doing this work without you knowing." She took the page. It was a restructured account plan. The Chen portfolio, lean and transparent, with a liability distribution that she could see had required real thought and real honesty about what had been obscured before. "You separated the personal trust elements from the commercial," she said. "I'd been conflating them for years. It made the account look cleaner than it was. I was hiding the complexity behind the complexity." She looked up at him. "You found that yourself." "Took me most of a month," he said. "And 3 conversations I should have had years ago." She set the page on her desk. He remained in the doorway. "I'm not here to ask you back to anything," he said. "I understand that's not available, and I'm not trying to negotiate from the wrong position." He looked at her steadily. "I'm here because you were the person I should have been talking to all along. For 12 years I talked past you. I don't have an explanation for that reflects well on me. I have an apology, and I have this." He gestured at the page, "which is the first thing I've done in a long time that I wanted you to see because it was yours to evaluate. Not because I needed something." Ingrid looked at him for a long time. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the chair across from her desk, not tentatively. He sat in the chair she gestured to in her office on her terms. "Tell me what your next 6 months look like," she said. "The real version, not the one you'd present to a client." He told her, the real one. The deals that hadn't recovered. The associate he was still trying to make right by. The 2 accounts still under pressure. He didn't smooth the edges. She asked questions. Sharp ones without softening. He answered them without deflecting. After an hour she sat back. "I'm not returning to what we were," she said. No. If there's something worth building here, it doesn't look anything like before. I'm not infrastructure. I'm not the foundation nobody mentions. I'm a partner, acknowledged, credited, visible, or I'm not here." "Yes," he said. "And if you ever, not out of malice but simply out of habit." "Tell me," he said before she could finish. "Tell me when I've done it. Don't disappear into it. I'm asking you to hold me accountable. I know I never asked you that before." She looked at him. "That's the first time you've ever asked to be corrected." "I know," he said. "I should have asked you that a long time ago." They didn't rebuild quickly. Real things never do. But they rebuilt honestly, which was something they had never done before. Not from the beginning, not from any beginning they had tried. They argued sometimes, the way people argue when they are genuinely invested, rather than managing the appearance of harmony. About the direction of his practice, about the shape of her business, about the line between what was shared and what was separately theirs. Graham learned to listen without waiting for his turn to speak. Ingrid learned to say difficult things before they became burdens she was carrying alone. She built her consultancy until it stood entirely on its own. Her name was on her own letterhead. Her clients came because of her reputation, which was no longer anyone else's. He rebuilt his practice smaller and truer. Leaner in the way that things stripped down to their actual load-bearing elements are always truer than the polished, decorated version. On a Thursday evening in late October, both of them were at the kitchen table with their respective laptops and their separate files, and Graham poured 2 glasses of wine without being asked. He set one beside her keyboard. She glanced at it, glanced at him. He was already looking back at his screen. They didn't toast, there was nothing to perform. They sat in the ordinary Thursday light, talking through a property question that had implications for both of their work, disagreeing on one point, and arriving, after a few minutes, at the realization that they were both right about different parts of it and laughing quietly at the specific comedy of that. Outside, the October leaves were coming down the way they always do, red and gold and unhurried, the kind of thing that happens every year whether anyone is paying attention or not. Ingrid picked up her glass, Graham picked up his. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. They sat there together in the middle of something that was, for the first time, being built by both of them. Something that had both of their names on it, something neither of them would ever have to carry alone. If this story reminded you that steadiness is not the same as invisibility, that the quiet work is still work, that the person holding everything together deserves to be seen, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, subscribe to Brave Soul Stories TV for more stories like this. Thank you for being here.